Welcome to Conversatio, the Belmont Abbey College podcast. I'm Julia Long, and today I'm joined by Father Matthew Schneider. Father, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get started, I'd just love for you to tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so I'm a Catholic priest with the Legionaries of Christ. The Legionaries are a religious community. We're all over Latin America and Europe and things like that. And our mission is really to help form people to be apostles at the service of the church.
Great.
And at least for now, I'm teaching here at Belmont, teaching theology. I'm originally from Calgary, Canada. My whole family still lives up there. I'm somewhat well known on social media and Catholic circles for writing articles and, tweeting and things like that. And I just finished my doctoral thesis at the end of June, July there.
Congrats.
That's kind of the transition to teaching this semester. So
what was your thesis on?
My thesis was on a Catholic theological analysis of the right to informational privacy. So it sounds kind of abstract, but the application to it, which I didn't get into as much, I stayed more on principles, would be things like the NSA or Facebook spying on you, or your boss asks you for a genetic test, or like HIPAA, the health privacy rules and things like that. So that would be the application of it. There really wasn't much in kind of Catholic theology on that. There's a lot in kind of secular thought. And I thought, well, what can Catholic theology add to this discussion? And so that's where I went with, 400 pages later, I have a doctoral thesis out of it. So
it's really crazy how that happens. That's similar, not 400 pages, but I did a master's thesis a couple of years ago. And it's crazy how it at some point takes on a life of its own. Well, I really am excited about our discussion today. So for some context for the audience, many of you may have seen the same tweet I saw from Britney Spears a little bit ago about not being permitted to marry in the Catholic Church. And she seemed a little bit disappointed by this fact. And the tweet that I saw was included in an article. And Father, you were quoted in that article. And being a Protestant myself, I'm not very familiar with the requirements to get married in the Catholic Church or the historical context. Why? Yeah. So I thought that this might be a really good opportunity for myself to be educated and maybe for our audience to learn a little bit too.
Yeah.
So I think a good place to start is just first of all, for maybe our listeners who aren't as familiar, what happened with Britney, right? Let's get into that.
Yeah, so Britney was visiting some beautiful church out in the LA area. I forget the name of it off the top of my head.
Yeah.
And she said, I wanted to be married here, but they said I had to be Catholic and had to do some kind of test or something like that.
Yeah.
Which does kind of correspond to a Catholic wedding. Like one of the two parties has to be Catholic, and you have to do some kind of preparation where you agree to follow church teaching and that. So
Yeah. Okay. So then she took to Twitter and shared, and then I think it was really interesting to see some of the discussion. Some people, came out and kind of in support of, well, yes, of course you would need to be Catholic, and then others were saying, why would you need to be? Couldn't you just get married in the place? So I think this is a good opportunity for you to help myself and our audience understand what is a Catholic wedding, what constitutes a Catholic wedding.
Well, I think we have to understand how the church understands marriage, because marriage ultimately is a reflection of the wedding between Christ and the church as a model for Catholic marriage. And Christ gave himself to the church gives itself to Christ completely. And that's kind of the model of a Catholic wedding. So that's like the kind of ideal. And that's also where we get a lot of the things that, Catholics are known for, that, it has to be a man and a woman. It can't be one man and three women. It has to be open to life because that's self-giving and that openness, and things like that. So those type of realities are like the most fundamental reality of the Catholic Church understanding of marriage in that sense is that sacramental understanding. Obviously, we also recognize a natural marriage. So, two non-Catholics get married, to atheists or to Hindus or whatever else. It's still a valid marriage, right? What we call a natural marriage, and it still should follow the same principles. It doesn't have the same motivation because there's not like that same spiritual connection, with Christ and the church. Like two Hindus are not imitating Christ in the church. They're not, or imitating. Sometimes it's also referred to in the Trinity, the Father and the Son, and then they bring forth the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
But the Hindus aren't imitating that either. So they're just like a man and a woman married, have their 3 kids or whatever. And
the church would recognize that as a natural marriage.
Yes, it would recognize that as a natural marriage, assuming the proper things are in place for a natural marriage.
Sure. And what are those proper things in place for a natural marriage?
So it needs to be a man and a woman, because it's kind of, the definition of a marriage includes for the procreation and education of children, and like a man and a woman are the only way to make children. And it needs to be open to children, not to say that it's necessarily going to have children. Like if you have a widow and widower who get married at 60, they probably are assuming that they won't have children unless there's a miracle, or if there's some kind of medical issue one of them already knows most likely they can't have kids, things like that. It needs to be exclusive in the sense that I intend just for you for the rest of my life. I'm not going to be with other women or other men.
Yeah.
And then permanent in the sense that till death do us part, that everybody has remembered from wedding vows that they've been to at weddings and things, and not just kind of like, we're going to do a trial marriage for the next 3 years. Sure. And then we'll see if we're going to actually have a marriage.
Yeah. And are those 3 principles the same for a sacramental marriage, or are there additional ones?
There's a few slight variations in details there in the sense, but they're essentially the same.
Okay. So, and you hit on this a little bit, but I had a friend who was not Catholic. She fell in love with a man who was. She was Protestant. They live in France now. They're married. He is Catholic. Now she is Catholic.
Yeah.
They were married in the Catholic Church. Is there, kind of a need for individuals who are not Catholic to convert to the faith to be married, or is that just more of a personal choice?
It's more of a personal choice. There's a requirement that they would allow their children to be raised Catholic if they have any children from the marriage, and that they agree to the principles of Catholic marriage in that sense, what you talked about. But they don't have to convert. Like, she got married before she converted. I have a brother-in-law who was in a similar situation, who's now Catholic but was not when he got married to my sister. And things like that. So that can happen, the conversion, but it's not that necessary to get married in a Catholic church. You need one of the 2 parties to be Catholic. You don't need both to be Catholic.
Okay. And are there differences in the actual ceremony between 2 Catholic individuals and not?
Not really significantly. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, that would be different.
Okay.
So
yeah. So I think this is a point of discussion in the public space about being able to be married in the Catholic Church. And I think one thing that always helps is to understand how we got here.
Yeah.
And the historical context. So can you tell us a little bit about how we got here?
Okay. Well, I think there's kind of 3 points. First of all, like any kind of group, if you have a religious house for that group, you're generally going to, at least one of the 2 parties getting married is going to need to be in that group, like if some friends of mine who were like a Christian and an atheist went to ask the synagogue, I wouldn't, unless one of them is, the synagogue's not going to say, yeah, come in, because neither of you is Jewish. Like, we'll do a wedding, but if one of you is Jewish, not if neither of you is. And I would expect the same thing from other religious houses, most likely as well.
Yeah.
And that's the first thing. The second thing is really that a lot of it goes back to that idea of the union of Christ and the church. In the sense, it's a primordial sacrament. Adam and Eve were married, as the first man and first woman. That's the sacrament they had. Yeah. And so we have it kind of like at the very, very beginning, we have marriage, and that marriage is that union in that sense. So, and it has those factors we talked about, that openness to children, that permanence, and that exclusivity. And then the third thing that's kind of interesting historically is about 500-600 years ago, there was kind of a social issue where people would secretly get married and nobody in town knew about it, and then it became kind of difficult because, to a certain extent, part of the nature of marriage is that it's public today. Like, if you get married, it's registered with the state. It's usually with a ceremony that's open to a whole bunch of people.
Yeah.
In the church, there is a requirement that you basically, that it's posted. Usually it's on like the parish website or parish bulletin, like so-and-so is going to get married. If there's an issue, please forward.
Yeah, speak now or forever hold your peace.
Well, no, yeah. Well, I mean, and the church is not just at the wedding. It's actually supposed to be in like the bulletin or something like that, or on the website. And that's not as needed today because we have all these electronic records and things.
Yeah.
But if you go back a few hundred years, post that in the town square, somebody else might be like, like she said she was married to this other guy, like told me like, 20, like 5 years ago. So that things like that, records weren't kept as well 200 years ago or whatever else, and things like that.
Yeah.
So that's and so it's an issue if people don't know. And so what was happening in these secret marriages? So the church, being kind of the one who registered marriages in the society at that time, basically said all the Catholics have to follow canonical form, which is basically a church wedding or an approval from the church to have a wedding in some other form from a Catholic church, which rarely given, but occasionally given for exceptional circumstances. So it's basically that the church you have to follow that form, being married in a church or being married with permission outside of a church.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And that's so interesting to me because, and this is probably not the space to get into it, but we know that kind of a recurring hot topic in society is the separation of church and state and all of these types of things. And people have different views about what, religious parties should be involved in and what they shouldn't. But you pointed out a little bit ago when we were offline that one of the things is that this was actually the church's responsibility first.
Yeah.
To kind of, I don't know, what did you say? Like help guide or, how intervene when marriage, help.
Well, the thing was that like for Catholics, and I think a lot of more traditional Protestants, you keep a registration at the church. Like I was baptized in St. Thomas More Church in Calgary, and if you go to St. Thomas More Church and you pull out my record, it will have that I was ordained a priest. So and if I disappeared, went somewhere else and tried to be like, I want to get married, then they're going to call up St. Thomas More Church and say, can we have this record? No, he's ordained he's a priest. He can't get married.
Right.
And so that record keeping has gone back far in the church. And so the church was responsible for a lot of the records until more recently. It was only around 1800, around the French Revolution, that marriages started being recognized by the state directly for all people. Some had earlier more just for nobles, because like noble descent mattered, but for the common, for a farmer in the 1600s, it was the church that registered his marriage, not the state at all.
It's a really interesting historical fact. The other thing that comes to mind goes back to the first point you said, which was that it would be assumed that wherever the wedding was being held, that at least one of those parties would have an affiliation to that. You use the example of the synagogue, right?
Yeah.
And why maybe a Protestant and an atheist would want to get married at a synagogue. One thing that I think, though, happens, especially in today's society around marriage, is that people are getting married outside the church. I just saw an article recently about a couple that in Tennessee, which is where I'm from, so I love Tennessee for everyone who's listening, but a couple in Tennessee who wanted to get married in Italy and couldn't afford it, so they went and got married at an Olive Garden, and their photos actually were quite beautiful. They did it against the old stone and it was really beautiful. But I mean, I think there's an interesting point here, because when we think historically about what you bring up about that marriages were registered in the church because it was a religious union, a commitment, marriage was, right? And now we're seeing that kind of, for some it's still very important, but we're also seeing society as a whole kind of take it and put their own unique spin on it, right? From Waffle House to Olive Garden. And it's like...
Okay, yeah. I don't know of too many weddings like that. I know like...
barns are popular these days.
In extended friends and family from my family, nobody in my immediate family gotten married like a convention center or on a ranch or something like that.
Yeah.
And those are the things. I think one of the challenges is that when the churches were in charge of weddings exclusively and the state wasn't involved at all, most towns at least, and even whole societies, were relatively religiously homogenous in that sense. Like they were all pretty much, like everybody was Catholic, 95% plus of the town was Catholic, and the other 5% might put on the, might officially get baptized even though they don't believe it, and put on the air just so they can participate in society in that sense. Whereas we live in a very pluralistic society, so you have Catholics, Protestants, atheists, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, etc., all in the U.S. And I think in that sense there is that sense, and I think a lot of it is that loss of a religious sense, where a lot of the people who are doing that, they're atheists, or they're like we're religious and we're Christians, but like we go to church occasionally, we pray occasionally. We're not really like living the faith in a week to week basis in that sense. Because I think most people who are going to a Catholic or Protestant service at least once a week are going to want to get married in their church.
Yeah. Yeah. I will say we kind of had an interesting situation because we got married on family property in Tennessee, which was an old Tennessee walking horse farm.
Oh, okay.
We did not get married in our church because mainly my husband and I grew up in two different churches and we're in the process of church searching together.
Oh, okay.
And so we have, of course, a church now, but at the time we each had our own churches. And so we thought, okay, well, we got married on family property and we got married by his childhood pastor.
Yeah. Well, no, in that sense, like I mean by church wedding is like with an official, like, pastor officiating things because, a lot of Protestant churches are A-okay with outdoor weddings and just bringing the pastor or whatever.
Yeah.
The Catholic Church in general is kind of hesitant about those.
Okay.
There's a few places where like the diocese permitted them, but they want to make sure you have a backup at an actual church in case like it rains or snows or something or inclement weather. Yeah. And I think it'd be a great thing for a lot of a lot of dioceses have like a shrine just outside of town. It's like a Marian shrine or something.
Oh yeah.
And if I was a bishop or I was in charge, I'd be like, let's set up an outdoor wedding chapel there. So then it's fully Catholic, everything else. And then the Catholics who want to get married outside, they can rent that space for 2 hours on Saturday, get married outside in the garden chapel, and fulfill their dreams and follow everything the Catholic Church teaches. Because I do think that there's a beauty in nature that is proper to that sense as well. It's not just like the stained glass and things like that. Like I really enjoy kind of where you have kind of that combination of like the beauty of nature and the religious sense. Like like in my office, it's I have a picture up there and it's a church in the woods and there's like some cardinals, like the birds in the foreground, and that's kind of like a beautiful kind of the combination of the nature and religious.
God's creation. I was thinking while you were talking that it's such an important point when we think about Catholic marriage and even Protestant marriage really, but the point of today is Catholic marriage. And we kind of laid out the three principles and stipulations, if you will. But then I think there's a larger commitment here, right? Maybe that's even once you've gotten married in the Catholic Church, you've agreed to these three things, but you're also agreeing to honor God and honor one another, right? And live a life together based on biblical.
Oh, definitely.
Right.
Definitely. I mean, in that sense, like you're going to live all the things like that, because it's, I promise to honor and respect all the days of my life, or the variation on the wedding thing, the wedding vows in that sense. And that's part of it, that you are going to honor and respect that other person. You are going to live according to the principles of the Bible and the catechism and things like that. Yeah. And there's also things like that didn't bring in, like you have to be free to marry. Like if Joe gets Jane pregnant and Jane's dad comes over to Joe and says, with a shotgun and says, you marry my daughter or else. Yeah. There's a good chance he's not really free in that sense to marry in that marriage. If I don't do this, he's going to shoot me. And so there is a sense in the Catholic Church you have to be free. And that's when you do the preparation for marriage, you usually meet with a priest or somebody else at the church, and they have a few questions, making sure all those kind of things like, permanent, exclusive, open to children, but also making sure you're free and not like coerced or something like that. Yeah. And there's a few other questions too, but those kind of things to make sure that you're ready and make sure that you intend to live according to biblical principles, live according to what the Catechism teaches in that sense.
I'm glad you brought that up because I think the concept of being free and as it relates to accepting marriage is similar to how God feels about giving us free will. Yeah. We're not puppets. He didn't say, here's earth, you have to follow me. He gave us a choice. Yeah. And marriage, I think, is a little bit parallel with that. In faith, you choose to follow God every day. Yeah. And in marriage, you choose to love that person every day. Yeah. So I think what we were talking about earlier, and again, no judgment to anyone who's getting married in a barn. I got married outside. But I think what we're seeing here, right, is a little bit of a societal shift.
Yeah.
Where the place shifts and maybe even some of the ideals shift, right? And then we come back to the importance of, okay, getting married in the Catholic Church and really making that commitment to have a biblical Christ-centered marriage.
Oh, definitely. And I think that's really a good point of it. You know, even like when you were saying, like, you got married on the farm, but you had, like, you know, you had a pastor,
Yes.
the childhood pastor come in and things. And so it was like, you know, it was and he probably followed the exact same form he would have followed had you been in his church.
Yeah.
As far as, like, you know, we do this, then we have these are the vows we use, and, you know, this is the blessing I give every couple or something.
Yeah,
I don't know exactly what different Protestants have slightly different things of those, but the general gist is the same. And so I think in that sense we have a lot to learn. You know, we have a lot to learn in our society to really go back to that religious sense, to bring in that religious sense to marriage, because it's not really just a union between the man and the woman. It's also a union with Jesus in that sense when it's a sacrament.
Right.
So it's, you know, Fulton Sheen, who's a famous Catholic archbishop from the mid 20th century, probably the best preacher of the mid 20th century. If you ever want to listen to him, he talked about it as three to get married. You know, it's the husband, the wife, and the Lord. In that sense.
Yeah, and you were saying earlier when we were talking about the history behind this, that originally the church kind of managed, you know, this marriage as a religious union, and then, you know, the state came and said, like, hey, that we actually need to have this registered through us as well, which in itself is not bad, right? You can see kind of the logical reasons for why this might need to happen, but you could also see how with the societal shift, it needs to not be just something regulated by the state and no religious affiliations. You know, I mean, you could say that is a tough thing for a marriage to not be centered in Christ. So there's kind of that dichotomy there, I think.
Oh yeah, like I think that the church, in that sense, the church in most cases, the vast majority of cases, requires that if you get married in the church, is also recognized by the state.
Yeah,
there's a few exceptions and things like that, but, like, you know, I did my sister's wedding about a year ago, right after they did the vows in the church and they're officially married in the church. Went to the sacristy where we all, like, the priest puts on all our gowns and things, and they signed the document for the state, you know, and the best man and best woman, not the best woman, maid of honor, maid of honor signed as well as the official witnesses, and I signed as the officiant, or whatever the technical term is there, for the state thing, and you know, and so they're married that way and I think a lot of it has to do with just how much record keeping goes on today versus, you know, a few hundred years ago, and things like that. Like, just think about it, like, even just that we have driver's licenses, whereas, you know, 300 years ago, it's like, you know, if you had the horse, you could ride the horse, and, like, you know, you didn't have a driver's license, you didn't have we didn't have all that paperwork and things. And so I think with that, you know, that is a good thing. But I do think you're right that kind of that loss of the religious sense of marriage is kind of damaging, because it does put that marriage on a less firm foundation, because it's just, instead of like me, you, and the infinite God, it's me and you alone, which is a whole lot less strong of a foundation.
Yeah. Yeah, that is 100% true. The other thing that I wanted to ask about before we kind of leave the historical piece is these secret marriages. You mentioned them, and it's probably my journalistic background. I'm so curious, what were they and why?
I'm not sure the whole why. I think a lot of times it would be, you know, kind of eloping, like the old-fashioned version of eloping and things like that.
Yeah.
But then it wouldn't be clear, even from behavior or things like that, where it wasn't clear who's married to who. And, like, marriage by its nature is supposed to be public, and part of that public is that, so, you know, like, you know, they know you're married, so they don't, like, somebody of the opposite sex doesn't approach you and think, oh, maybe I can flirt with them, and maybe, you know, it's like I was. You know, it's like, I just was talking to somebody else, and they're like, oh, they're wearing a wedding ring. If somebody was single, and they're like, oh, they're wearing a wedding ring, I can't flirt with them. Otherwise I would.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And in that sense, and that's valuable in society. There's a whole kind of thing. I'm not a super expert in that specific area. I just know that was a little bit of an issue 500-600 years ago, and that's why they instituted that what's now called canonical form,
Okay.
which is required for all Catholics to get married. So,
Yeah.
either in the church or in exceptional cases outside the church with approval from the church.
Sure. So, okay, so we've looked at, the initial thing that happened with Britney, which is what got us here. Then we've looked at kind of what makes a Catholic marriage a Catholic marriage. We've looked at the historical reasons behind it. And I think we've even gotten into a really important topic, which is kind of the societal trends and, that maybe some of the loss of religion in marriage today. So I think this is a good time as we kind of round up here to talk about any misconceptions that people have maybe against the Catholic Church and marriage. So I'll be honest, one thing I kind of thought, because my friend, the friend that I mentioned earlier in the podcast who now lives in France, she converted. I at one point thought that you had to be Catholic to get married in the church, right?
Yeah, whereas only one party does.
Right.
Like my grandma got married with my grandpa in the Catholic Church, and she was buried a Presbyterian. She was a Presbyterian when she got married. She was buried a Presbyterian, 40 some years later.
Yeah.
No, 50 some, because they had their 50th anniversary. So
yeah, that's special. So I think one of the things that happens sometimes is that people hear of certain things and they don't always understand the historical context of why. And then they may not even understand kind of the principle in entirety, right? Like the example here of, only one person needs to be Catholic and not both. Are there other societal misconceptions you can think of that you just like to point out and explain?
Well, I think the biggest one is a lot of people think of like an annulment as just a Catholic divorce, whereas an annulment is saying that never happened.
Okay.
The law actually, the secular law even has annulments for marriages, but they're much rarer than in the church, because I remember I was hearing about some celebrity or something, and they got married while drunk in Vegas, and the next day they didn't want to be married, and they got an annulment as if that marriage never happened, because they're like, I was drunk out of my mind, I wasn't free to consent, and the state even recognized that wasn't a valid marriage. So the Catholic Church, we have annulments, but the annulment is not to say you can get divorced. It's to say that this marriage never happened because of some defect, whether it's one person was, basically lying on the forms and said they wanted to be exclusive, but really they wanted to, sleep around with all kinds of women, or something like that, or like they weren't free, or different issues like that make it so that the marriage never actually happened, which is different from a divorce, which is saying this marriage happened, but we can eliminate, we can break it off and have a new marriage. And that really goes back to that idea of it's union between Christ and the church, and the union of Christ and the church is eternal. It doesn't just break off, when there's a little bit of a challenge, like, because the church is imperfect, and this bishop or this priest does something bad. It's not like, we break off the union of Christ and the church.
Yeah, and I remember you referenced that in the article that I mentioned at the beginning of this with Brittany. You said that in order to be able to get married in the Catholic Church, she would also need to have had, I think, annulments on her previous two marriages. Is that right?
It might have even been her that had the one where she was drunk. I'm not sure.
I don't know.
It might have been like she was drunk, and it was like the next day she got an annulment for that, which in a secular one. I just remember I read that somewhere in the last year or so.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the reality on the thing is you need to resolve those there's different circumstances, but it's not. A lot of times when you're getting married in situations like that, like drunk in Vegas, or even, in Vegas, not so drunk out of your mind that legally it's not allowed. We might have a little higher standard for, you're competent to make this choice than the state would.
Yeah.
In that sense, if you're kind of, drunk on a bender in Vegas or something.
Yeah. So I am so glad you brought this up, because divorce and annulments are not something that we have covered here. Are there ever any reasons for a divorce or an annulment that the Catholic Church would recognize as valid, such as, abuse or something like that?
Well, so the thing is that there's a distinction here in the sense that, like a civil divorce, if there's abuse, separation and if need be, civil divorce for, to protect the other person. 100% the church supports that. To support the ones so they don't get like beat up or things like that. Or,
really harmed,
there may be something in there that's showing an annulment previously, like if the person who was abusive was basically threatening the other person to the point that they felt that if they didn't go through with the marriage, they would be like beat to death. That's obviously like a lack of that might. Well, I shouldn't say obviously that, but there's very likely a lack of freedom in that. So there could be an annulment on that, but it's not that okay. This person, this man or woman was abusive, therefore the marriage can be annulled, and a civil divorce can often be needed to protect the other spouse and the kids and things like that.
Yeah. And okay, that's helpful to understand. And then any other kind of misconceptions that you think are worth?
I think that's the biggest one. I think the annulments, and then like your thing about that. I think a lot of people, I think we already kind of went over it to some of the details. Why the church requires things like only a man or a woman, or like openness to children, things like that. But I think we already went over that earlier in the podcast.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let's just recap the reasons why Britney couldn't get married in the church. So she goes and she sees this beautiful church in LA and she wants to get married there, and then she can't.
Well, the first thing is one of the two has to be Catholic, and I don't know if Britney is Catholic. She was raised Baptist. She's expressed interest in the Catholic Church in previous posts, but exactly how far along that's gone or what's happened in that regard is not publicly available. I don't have any special knowledge. I just have what's publicly available.
You're not calling her up on the phone to ask?
Nope, I don't have her number. I just have, the news reports that are out there. And then they would have to, usually do some kind of preparation, usually for a short period of time, make sure that everything's set. And, often meeting with a priest or meeting with a couple who's been married a while or something like that. And, agreed all the things we've gone over, as far as the, different things for Catholic, being a Catholic wedding, and that, we want it exclusive, just us, permanent. We are open to kids, and, we're going to raise the kids Catholic. But it's, but a lot of those, it's not clear. She just kind of said, they need some kind of test, which is kind of vague in that sense.
Yeah.
And things. So that would be why she couldn't, she's welcome to become Catholic and follow through with those things. But that might take a little bit of time for her to become Catholic or her fiance to become Catholic. I don't know the exact details of his life either. So
right, but if he had been Catholic, then and they had agreed to those three things, it is likely then that they could have gotten married in the church.
Yes,
right. Even if she herself weren't.
Exactly. I mean, it's just like I have a brother-in-law who was not Catholic when they got married. He's Catholic now, but he wasn't when he married my sister, and they had a wedding, in the church my family goes to and everything. So
would her previous marriages have had to have been annulled in order for her to get married in the church?
Yes. You'd have to go into the details on those, what the issues are. I don't know. I don't know enough about like Britney's romantic life to make any comment on that. Although given the kind of past and the kind of way celebrities are, there's a reasonably good chance that that an annulment would be possible in those cases. Sure.
Well, it's been really enlightening personally for me to have you here today, Father, and I appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
And I hope it's been helpful for you, our audience, too. If you're enjoying Conversatio, like, share, and tell your friends. You can find us on Google Play, the App Store, Spotify, and anywhere that you usually find your podcasts. Until next time, I'm Julia Long. God bless.